They did not die at the same time, not in the same place, not in the same way. One was crucified upside down, one was flayed alive, one was beheaded, one was pierced with a spear, one was thrown from the roof of the temple, one died quietly in the deep forests of the East. 12 deaths, scattered from Rome to India, seem to have nothing in common but one word: martyrdom. But what if these events were not random? What if the death of each apostle was, in fact, the final chapter of a schedule established before the dawn of time? There is an ancient text, once received by Moses on Mount Sinai, called the Book of Jubilees, a book excluded from most Western Bibles. But its contents do not repeat Genesis. It doesn't narrate history as a flow of events, but rather numbers each occurrence according to a sacred cycle. In it, time doesn't flow like a river. Time is counted like the tolling of a bell. Every event happens exactly on the appointed week, appointed year, appointed jubilee that God has ordained. The first sin, the first death, the fall of the Watchers, the great flood, the covenant with Abraham, the destruction of Sodom, the first Passover. Every major event in the Bible occurred on schedule, not early, not late, and never by chance. So what about the death of the 12 apostles? Could it be that these were not tragic accidents, nor the unfortunate results of faith, but sacred milestones set by God in advance, as the final offerings of blood to close one era and usher in another? Amid blood and fire, amid swords and proclamation, these deaths may have been the closing notes of a covenant that lasted precisely one cycle. If that's true, then we have misunderstood their deaths. We thought they were extinguished, but in truth, they were offered, not randomly, but right on time. Just as Abraham wasn't called by coincidence, just as Enoch wasn't taken without purpose, just as Noah didn't survive by luck. They died as a final reminder that God never forgets his appointed times. Only man forgets the clock of heaven. They did not die to impress, nor did they die in defeat. They died because they were the last ones who still carried a sacred memory too heavy for the world to bear. Each death, a cut upon the map of persecution, but also a seal upon a generation whose role had been fulfilled. They weren't just witnesses to a life, they were witnesses to a written era, now drawing to a close. From Galilee to Rome, from the sea to the island of Patmos, the apostles did not walk as lone missionaries, but as living pillars, establishing the foundation of a new covenant. They saw the risen one. They touched eternity with blood-stained hands, and they did not keep it to themselves. They carried the fire and allowed their very bodies to become the sacrifice, so that the light would continue to spread. Paul once wrote, "We are killed all day long. We are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered." But those words did not come from despair. They were a sacred declaration. If a death is required to confirm a truth, then that is not something to avoid. It is a role given at the right time to ensure the covenant does not fall into the abyss of forgetfulness. They were not victims of violence. They were those who completed a testimony and revealed that there are still souls who would rather burn than dim the light. In a Roman world of decay and idols, they did not overthrow the empire with swords. They let their blood soak into the soil, so that from it would grow a faith that has never been extinguished to this day. Could it be that God did not stop their deaths, not because he was silent, but because they had reached their appointed time for the promise to move into a new generation. Could it be that each of them, like a final week in a 49-year cycle, was offered up as a complete harmony, closing the covenant with their very lives? If that's true, then they did not die only for faith. They died because history needed an ending, and God wrote that ending with their names. We live by the hour, wake at 7, eat lunch at 12, clock out at 5. We count days, months, years, as if time were just empty cycles of numbers. But in the Book of Jubilees, time is not measured by hands on a clock. It is measured by the heartbeat of the covenant. From the beginning, God did not only create light and darkness, but he also established a sacred calendar. This calendar was not for agriculture, but for promise. Not for farming, but for maintaining the relationship between heaven and earth. Each cycle was called a Jubilee, lasting 49 years, made up of 7 sets of 7 years, and every major event in history was marked by these cycles. Jubilees doesn't say the flood came when mankind was too sinful. It says clearly that it happened in year 1307 from creation, during the second week of the 13th Jubilee. The covenant with Abraham wasn't random either. It came in year 1876, exactly when every element of a new covenant had matured. Everything was recorded. Everything was appointed. God does not act on impulse. He does not react out of offense. He does not intervene because he's provoked. Every action, from judgment to blessing, is a movement in the divine symphony he composed before the first dawn. And humanity, if unaware of that symphony, will think God is slow or silent or unjust. But in truth, God is watching the timing like a conductor, and every event unfolds in rhythm with a grand covenant song. And here is where we must pause. If God appointed every event from Eden to Egypt, from the flood to the 10 Commandments, then why would the deaths of the apostles be off calendar? Or more precisely, perhaps we never knew how to read that calendar, so we assumed the apostles died in chaos. But they died right on time. The Book of Jubilees does not give us a wall calendar. It gives us a sacred clock and invites us to live differently, not to chase time, but to watch for appointed moments, not to panic over delays, but to listen. Your sacred time is drawing near. James, the son of Zebedee, the older brother of John, was the first of the apostles to fall. According to Acts, he was beheaded by the order of King Herod Agrippa around the year 44 AD, right during the Passover season. It was not a death in darkness. It was the first death of a man who had seen the Transfiguration, who once cast his nets for fish and then dropped them to follow the teacher. And now James laid down even his life to keep the vow he had made. But something deeper was happening. In the Book of Jubilees, Passover is not just a historical day. It is a recurring milestone where events of liberation and transition repeat in cycles. The flood occurred near that same time. Israel was rescued from Egypt right at that time. And now James, the first of the 12, falls also during Passover week. Could it be his death was not merely the result of persecution, but the opening note of a new sacred cycle, a first fruits offering for the age of the witnesses? In the book of Exodus, God commands, "You must offer me the first fruits, for that portion belongs to me." The death of James was not the leftovers. It was the first portion. Offered not to end but to begin. From that death, the apostolic blood began to flow through Rome, through Ethiopia, through India, through every corner of the empire, each one following James like a stalk of grain beside him, harvested in time, in order, until the first field was fully gathered. And then a new season would begin. According to the Jubilees calendar, one Jubilee cycle lasts 49 years. From the year 44, when James was martyred, to the year 93 or 94, when John is believed to have died in Ephesus, is exactly one cycle, one lifetime, one generation, one era of martyrdom, begun with the death of one man during a Passover week, as if his very blood declared, "A new age of the covenant has begun." If that's true, then James was not just the first to die. He was the signal that opened the gate, the first bell in the final symphony of the first generation. And if there was one to begin on time, then there would surely be one to end on time, and that would be the story of the last, John. If James's death marked the beginning, then who closed that cycle? All signs point to one name, John, the younger brother in the same boat, called by the same teacher. One died by sword, one survived oil and exile, but both mark the beginning and end of a time that was anything but random. James was killed in 44 AD. John is believed to have died between 94 and 98 AD, and between those two markers is nearly a full Jubilee cycle, 49 years, not a scattered, undefined century, but a sacred unit of time that the Book of Jubilees consistently uses to measure decisive moments in redemptive history. A jubilee is not just a number. It is a season in theological history where God executes turning points of destiny. Abraham received the promise in a jubilee. Israel was delivered in a jubilee. The nation was restored from exile in a jubilee. And now, could it be that the early church was also formed, solidified, and transitioned through a blood-filled jubilee? Look more closely. From the first death, James beheaded near Passover, until John was brought back to Ephesus after exile on Patmos. He was the last to see the Lord with earthly eyes, the last to lean his head on the Master's chest. When he died, no one could say any more, "I have seen him." And he, through the book of Revelation, opened the vision of what is to come in order to close what has been. From the year 44 to around 94-95 AD, the Church lived under the witness of 12 pillars, then, one by one, each fell, not by surprise, not by chance, but as if each death was a timely farewell, making room for the next generation, the martyrs, the church fathers, and the newly forming communities outside the land of Israel. And when that cycle closed, the church entered a new season, no longer with apostles, but with Scripture. No longer eyes that saw and ears that heard, but the Word now written down. No longer John writing, but thousands of priests reading every line he left behind. A season of blood had ended. A season of writing, recording, preserving had begun. And if that is true, if an entire generation of martyrs was enclosed in a single 49-year cycle, then we are no longer permitted to think of their deaths as scattered. They were a symphony, each one falling at the right note, the right rhythm, the right moment. to complete a song God had written from the beginning. In the heart of the Roman Empire, amidst the chaos of fire and blood, two brothers, Peter and Andrew, fell, not on the same day, but within the same era, not in the same city, but within the same cycle, and neither of them resisted death, because they understood the time had come. Peter, the one who once denied the Lord, but also the one called the Rock, the one given the keys, the one who stood up to preach on the first Pentecost, the one who opened the first door to the Gentiles. And then, at the end of his journey, Peter was arrested in Rome during the reign of Emperor Nero. He was sentenced to death by crucifixion, but he requested to be crucified upside down, believing he was unworthy to die in the same way as his master. But in the light of Jubilees, that gesture was more than humility. It was a profound theological symbol. Peter knew the covenant was being overturned. Israel had rejected the Messiah. The temple was about to fall. The old order was collapsing. And he, as the Rock, had to turn himself upside down to seal a new era. A church no longer bound to Jerusalem, but expanding to the ends of the earth. Being crucified upside down was the image of a covenant being flipped, but it was also the proclamation that from this inversion a new order would rise. No longer would stone temples be needed. Each believer would become a living temple. No longer would the chosen be defined by bloodline. Every soul who believes would be joined to the body of the crucified one. And Andrew, the first to be called, died differently, but with the same spirit. He was tied, not nailed, to an X-shaped cross. And for 2 full days he continued to preach from that wooden beam, amid the shouts and indifference of the crowd. He did not ask to be rescued. He prayed that the word would be heard, and that slanted cross from then on became the symbol of Scotland, not because of beauty, but because pain had been transformed into light. Peter and Andrew, 2 brothers, 2 foundational pillars, both chose to die in inverted form. They did not die carelessly. They died on time, mid-cycle, like a drumbeat in the middle of a symphony, where the center always echoes the loudest. Not because they were victims, but because they were signals. The final 2 pillars flipped so that a new foundation could be laid. Thomas, the one who once doubted the Lord's wounds, became the one who brought the gospel the farthest. After touching the resurrected body, he was no longer a doubter. He became the one sent to places no one dared to go. Tradition says he left Jerusalem, crossed deserts, passed through Persia, and finally arrived in India, a land that had never heard the name Yeshua, never known the Old Testament, never longed for a Messiah. But that is precisely what the Book of Jubilees had foretold. In chapter 10, the book lists 70 nations that emerged after the flood, each assigned a land, a language, and a time of their own. But beneath the surface of that geography is a silent declaration. Every nation would one day hear the name of God. The covenant, though made with one people, was always aimed at all. And for that prophecy to be fulfilled, someone had to step beyond the center, into the uncharted, and lay down his blood as the beginning of a new calling. Thomas did that. He came to India not with armies, not with power, not with a Roman passport. He brought the word. And that word, which did not fit temple walls, was received by simple hearts. He preached, built communities, established chapels. But his success did not last long. Local priests, afraid of losing influence, sent assassins after him. Thomas died by a spear, pierced in the chest, the same place where he had once placed his hand on the risen body. That death was not the end. It was the fulfillment of Genesis. A nation that had never heard, now knew. A land once labeled as pagan had now become a foundation stone for the Eastern Church. And to this day, millions of believers in India still call him our apostle. If the Book of Jubilees is true, that 70 nations were written into the sacred calendar, then the death of Thomas is a milestone, a step, a cycle, a door opened by blood, so that the flow of the covenant would no longer be confined to the borders of Israel. Thomas was once the man who said, "I must see to believe." But in the end, he became the one others would have to see to dare believe. He died as a living map, marking the place where the covenant began to go global. Matthew, once a tax collector, despised by his own people, became the man who recorded the most precious words ever spoken on earth. He didn't just follow Christ. He wrote down every parable, every miracle, every heartbeat of the one who changed his life, so that future generations could hear. The Gospel of Matthew was the first scroll of the New Testament, beginning with a genealogy, ending with a command: "Go and make disciples of all nations." But is it possible that he was not meant to be remembered only as a writer? Tradition holds that Matthew went to Ethiopia, preaching in mountain towns, establishing communities among the Gentiles. And it was there, during the celebration of the Holy Eucharist, that he was stabbed to death, right at the altar where he had just read the Word of God. Not by chance, not by tragedy, but as a final rite. The Word was proclaimed, then the blood was offered. In the Book of Jubilees, whenever a new covenant is established, two things always occur. A word is proclaimed, and a sacrifice is made. The covenant with Abraham involved cutting animals in two. The covenant with Noah involved an altar and incense. The covenant at Sinai was sealed with blood sprinkled on the people. Matthew lived as a priest. He wrote the words of the new covenant and offered his own life as the blood of that covenant. None of his words were written in ink. They were sealed in blood. And that blood did not spill on a battlefield, but on an altar, the meeting place of heaven and earth, where words become reality, where covenant is renewed. What is remarkable is this. The Church Fathers tell us Matthew died while preaching about forgiveness. No curses, no escape. He died with the sermon unfinished, as if his life was the final sentence. A period, not to end the message, but to engrave it. In the light of Jubilees, Matthew's death was not simply a tragedy. It was the final liturgical act, where word and blood met to form a new chapter. And through it, his writings became more than scripture. They became relics, sealed with his very life. They are not often mentioned. There are no great cathedrals named after them, no national emblems like Andrew's cross. They did not write Gospels. They rarely appear in Acts. But Bartholomew and Philip were among those who went far and fell in places few had ever considered. Bartholomew, also called Nathanael, brought the gospel to Armenia, where he not only preached but converted a king. But that glory did not last. Pagan priests, fearing the loss of their power, stirred up the king's brother to carry out an execution. The sentence? Flayed alive, then beheaded. One of the most brutal martyrdoms recorded in church history. Philip, the one who once said to Jesus, "Lord, show us the Father," brought the gospel to Hierapolis in what is now Turkey. There he healed the sick, cast out demons, and preached the word in a land devoted to the sun god. And then he was arrested, crucified on a T-shaped cross. But before he died, he pleaded for the forgiveness of those who crucified him. Tradition says some were converted immediately, moved by the peace that radiated from him. In the common view, these deaths might be called quiet. But in the light of Jubilees, quiet does not mean meaningless. In that book, every person appears at the right time, the right place, the appointed moment in the covenant. No one is a side character. Each one is a note in the symphony, a vital link in the chain of Jubilee cycles. Bartholomew and Philip died at the exact moment when the lands they had entered were ready to be opened, as if the covenant had waited until that season to stretch its arms toward peoples still outside the borders of the promise. Their deaths were not loud, but they were anchor points for communities that quietly grew and survived for centuries after. Not everyone is called to be a rock like Peter, but everyone has a place, a role, a time that has been written down. And if we believe that God uses time as a language, then Bartholomew and Philip are the commas and pauses, not loud, but preserving the continuity of the covenant text until today. Amid a long list of painful deaths, beheadings, flayings, crucifixions, spears, there is one name that stands apart, not because he was greater, but because he carried a different assignment. John, the younger brother of James, the one called the disciple whom Jesus loved, did not die like the other apostles. Tradition says he was arrested under Emperor Domitian, thrown into a vat of boiling oil, but did not die. He was then exiled to the island of Patmos, a dry, rocky, desolate place. There he was not called to die, he was called to write. And on that very island he received a vision, a grand sequence of revelations that became the final book of the New Testament. Revelation. If the other apostles were those who sealed the covenant in blood, then John was the one who sealed the covenant with words. The final word, the final vision. A map for the end times. The Book of Jubilees once mentioned a figure very much like him, Enoch, a man who lived in an age of corruption but was preserved, a man who did not die but was taken up because he wrote down all that had happened so future generations would remember. Enoch, the quiet prophet of the pre-flood world. John, the solitary prophet of the post-resurrection age. Both did not die in body, but lived as a lamp shining into the end of days. John was not as glorified as Peter, not as adventurous as Thomas, not martyred like James, but he carried within himself the full memory of Jesus, from the miracle at Cana to the cross. He was the only one who stood at the foot of the cross, the last to care for the Virgin Mary, the one who lived long enough to see the church transform from Jewish to global and begin to be corrupted by power. And perhaps that's why he wasn't allowed to die early. He had to live to the end of the cycle, to see it all, to record it all, and to write, "Blessed is the one who reads and hears the words of this book." If every death of the apostles was scheduled, then perhaps John's non-death was also a preordained event, one kept not to live longer, but to live rightly. Like Enoch, John was the survivor of a generation, and from that quiet life a door opened, not for the past, but for the end. 12 men, 12 deaths, 12 flames, each falling in different corners of the ancient world. But if you thought they died to end an age, you may have misunderstood the entire map of the covenant, because in the light of the Book of Jubilees, every first fruit offering does not end the previous season. It initiates a new one. Every time a cycle begins, it requires a sacrifice. The first item, the first blood, the finest part, not to repay a debt, but to declare the season has come. The deaths of the apostles, from James to John, were not tragic consequences. They were a consecration ceremony by blood. When James fell, the covenant stepped outside Israel's borders. When Peter and Paul died in Rome, the covenant crossed the empire. When Thomas fell in India, the covenant reached the east. When John closed his eyes in Ephesus, the covenant was sealed with a vision of the end. Not one drop of blood was meaningless. Not one death was silent. They died at the right time, in the right place, to sanctify the entire world, as if God was offering a sacrifice, not on a temple altar, but across nations, from the stones of Judea to the Aegean Sea, from the Nile to the Armenian highlands. And after the blood was offered, a new season began, the season of the church, the season of the written word, the season of those who have not seen but still believe, the season of you and me. In the Book of Jubilees, after every great act of God, there is always a re-covenanting ceremony. And then a new generation rises. We do not live in the age of the apostles, but we are living in the season their blood has opened. And if they offered themselves as the first fruits, then we are invited to live as the latter fruits, no less consecrated. No, they did not die to be forgotten. They died so that every generation after would know the covenant still lives. Their blood did not close the story. Their blood was the bell that opened the gate, signaling that God's plan has turned a page, and that page is being written through our very lives. No one is asking you to climb a cross. No one is asking you to shed blood. But the question still stands. Are you ready to live on schedule? In the Book of Jubilees, everything happens in the appointed week, the appointed year, the appointed cycle. So, if you're alive today, it is not an accident. Perhaps you were written into a specific moment for a specific role in the divine covenant God has never set aside. The covenant is not only for martyrs. The covenant is for those who live faithfully in the right time, those who keep the fire quietly, those who remain patient in chaos, those who are willing to step into a small role to fulfill a plan greater than themselves. Maybe you are not the one to begin a cycle, nor the one to close history. But if you can carry the light at the right time, you are living your role, your time, your appointment. Look again at your calendar, your work schedule, your meetings, your assignments, your travel plans, birthdays, appointments and events. And every date is marked. But have you ever wondered, which day is God's day for me? Which moment was not scheduled by me, but written for me since the beginning? If the Book of Jubilees is right, then time is not an endless chain of busyness. It is a sacred map. Every day you live might be a small dot, but it belongs to a greater cycle. And if the apostles fulfilled their appointments with blood, then you can fulfill yours with a faithful, quiet, courageous life. So, don't keep what you've just discovered to yourself. Don't let the stirring end with the last seconds of this video. Share what touched you. Leave a comment, a promise, a decision. That might be the way you record your appointment, like the forefathers did when they entered a covenant. And if this means something to you, hit follow, not for the numbers, but because this journey shouldn't end here. This is not just a video. This is a calling to live differently, to count time not like the world, but like a keeper of the covenant, to see each day not as routine, but as part of a divine rhythm you're invited to step into. Right now, the old calendar still hangs, but you can write a new one with light. And once you live by that calendar, you won't need martyrdom to leave a testimony, a mark, an appointment fulfilled. You've just walked through 12 deaths, each death a flame that rose and went out, but the light was never lost. None of them live today, but if you are still listening, perhaps a part of the covenant is still continuing through you. From Genesis to Jubilees, from Abraham to John, from blood on the altar to the final written word of Revelation, everything has been connected by one thread, the appointed time of God. No one arrived early. No one was left behind. Each lived and died right when they were written in. And if that is true of the apostles, perhaps it's true of you too. You are not Peter. You are not John. But you have a breath, a moment, a word yet to be spoken. And maybe that word is being written into the Jubilee of this era, not in print, but in your life, not in blood, but in daily choices. Choose forgiveness. Choose to keep the fire. Choose to walk when others stand still. Maybe you live in a world that doesn't require martyrdom, but deeply needs people who live on time in their role with the Word. And if the first ones paved the road with their lives, then the ones who follow must not live off beat. We must not forget that we stand on ground soaked in blood, a history sealed by sacrifice, so that you and I can open a new page with faithfulness. Take a few minutes after this video to sit with yourself. Write down something you will change or something you will guard, so that this story is not just heard, but lived. And if you are one of the few who remember these truths, maybe you're not just a listener. Maybe you've been chosen to tell the story, to guard the sacred things so many generations have lost. Don't keep it to yourself. Share in the comments. What touched you most? What phrase awakened you? Together, we will reopen the doors that have been locked. There are stories that never truly end. They live quietly in how we choose to live each day. Today's story, where will it continue, if not in your own heart? Amen.